The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, Lord.
Tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to listen to Jesus, but the Pharisees and scribes began to complain, saying, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." So to them he addressed this parable. What man among you, having 100 sheep and losing one of them, would not leave the 99 in the desert and go after the lost one until he finds it? And when he does find it, he sets it on his shoulders with great joy, and upon his arrival home, he calls together his friends and neighbors and says to them, "Rejoice with me, because I have found my lost sheep." I tell you, in just the same way, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous people who have no need of repentance. Or what woman, having 10 coins and losing one, would not light a lamp and sweep the house, searching carefully until she finds it? And when she does find it, she calls together her friends and neighbors and says to them, "Rejoice with me, because I have found the coin that I lost." In just the same way, I tell you, there will be rejoicing among the angels of God over one sinner who repents. Then he said, "A man had 2 sons, and the younger son said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of your estate that should come to me.' So the father divided the property between them. After a few days, the younger son collected all his belongings and set off to a distant country, where he squandered his inheritance on a life of dissipation. When he had freely spent everything, a severe famine struck that country, and he found himself in dire need. So he hired himself out to one of the local citizens, who sent him to his farm to tend the swine. And he longed to eat his fill of the pods on which the swine fed, but nobody gave him any. Coming to his senses, he thought, 'How many of my father's hired workers have more than enough food to eat, but here am I, dying from hunger. I shall get up and go to my father, and shall say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son. Treat me as you would treat one of your hired workers.' So he got up and went back to his father. While he was still a long way off, his father caught sight of him and was filled with compassion. He ran to his son, embraced him, and kissed him. His son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son.' But his father ordered his servants, 'Quickly, bring the finest robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Take the fattened calf and slaughter it. Then let us celebrate with a feast. Because this son of mine was dead and has come to life again. He was lost and has been found.' Then the celebration began. Now the older son had been out in the field, and on his way back, as he neared the house, he heard the sound of music and dancing. He called one of the servants and asked what this might mean. The servant said to him, 'Your brother has returned, and your father has slaughtered the fattened calf, because he has him back safe and sound.' He became angry, and when he refused to enter the house, his father came out and pleaded with him. He said to his father in reply, 'Look, all these years I served you, and not once did I disobey your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat to feast on with my friends. But when your son returns, who swallowed up your property with prostitutes, for him you slaughtered the fattened calf.' He said to him, 'My son, you are here with me always. Everything I have is yours. But now we must celebrate and rejoice, because your brother was dead and has come to life again. He was lost and has been found.'" The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
As if that Gospel wasn't long enough, it's a long Gospel, 32 verses. I'm going to give you another short one. And right below me is the portrait of the prodigal son by Rembrandt. And if you look at the far right, you'll see a tall man standing. And next to him is a person with their arm across their breast. sitting. And Jesus addressed this parable to those who were convinced of their own righteousness and despised everyone else. Two people went up to the temple area to pray. One was a Pharisee, the other was a tax collector. The Pharisee took up his position and spoke this prayer to himself. "Oh God, I thank you that I am not like the rest of humanity, greedy, dishonest, adulterous, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week, and I pay tithes on my whole income." But the tax collector stood off at a distance and would not even raise his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast and prayed, "O God, be merciful to me, a sinner." I tell you, the latter went home justified, not the former. For everyone who exalts himself will be humble, and the one who humbles himself will be exalted. So while you think of this as the portrait of the prodigal son, it's also a portrait of the Pharisee and the tax collector. And I think that just is a beautiful image of the proud Pharisee who is dressed and adorned with a red cloak, standing in the light, his face in the light. He's got his walking stick, and he's standing very erectly, very properly. Really identifies well, I think, with this particular second gospel that I read to you today. And then you've got the man sitting in the dark, beating his breast. Reminds us of that image, not of a righteous man, but of a tax collector, a sinner. If you remember how today's gospel begins, it begins with tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to Jesus. And the Pharisees and scribes complained, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." So sometimes we learn, I think, through bad example. And today we have some particularly good bad examples. Right? We're seeing people acting up in the Old Testament. We're seeing St. Paul talking about his former life. We hear in the gospel today the bad example of the younger son at the beginning and then the older son toward the end. And so sometimes we learn through the positives, but a lot of times we have to learn through the negative. We learn through trial and error, right? Those are some of the times when we really learn something. When we teach a little child not to touch the hot stove, we don't explain to them degrees and if it's this warm or that warm and the boiling points and all those. We just say, "Don't touch hot," right? We say, "No, don't do that." So a lot of times that's the way we teach. And I think today we have this wonderful example in a way of how not to be. And for many of us, we right away think I must be talking about the younger son, but I'm talking more about the older son. And for many of us, we kind of identify with the older son or the Pharisee or the righteous ones, and we really kind of get this when we think about the parable of the tenants in the vineyard, where the people that work from dawn till the end of the day, who agreed to a just wage, a daily wage, get paid the same amount as those people that only work for 1 hour or that only work for 3 hours. And I think in our mentality we say, well, if the person working 1 hour got a day's wage, geez, that person who worked 3 hours, they got a day's wage. And well, if I worked the whole day, well, I would expect to get more from God, more from the landowner than those other people. And right away we begin to notice something ugly in ourselves, and we notice somehow that we play this comparison game of looking either with disdain upon others, or even worse, we look at God that way. Like, what's wrong with you, God? Why didn't you pay me more? I deserve more because I worked more. And today, in the picture, if you look at the Pharisee, that older brother, looking down upon the scene of reconciliation between a father and his prodigal son, you can only imagine what he might be thinking. But he may be actually more upset at his father than his brother. So let that sink in for a second. He may have every right to be upset with his brother. After all, his brother did squander his portion of the inheritance, but he looks down upon his father. And what does he look down on him with? Well, I think it's tremendous resentment, because he looks upon his father as a person who judges wrongly. Because for all these years, he served his father and obeyed his father, and as it says in the gospel today, was never given even a young goat. Where his brother comes back and not only gets a fattened calf, but he gets reinstated. And that happens through the ring on his finger, the robe, which is indicative of Rembrandt here putting robes on, or cloaks on the father and the elder of son. Doesn't seem fair, does it, you older brothers? Does it? And so when we have that sense within ourselves that we think that that's not fair, who are we judging? We're not judging the younger brother. We're not judging the older brother. We're judging God himself. And we can do this so easily, get lost in that resentment that someone else has something that we don't have. Or that, heaven forbid, when we get to heaven, someone that we don't think should be there is there. And some of you will say that about yours truly. I can't believe Deacon David's here. It's not a far step before we begin to judge God. It comes right after we may just begin to judge our neighbor. And it's really clear. And I think Rembrandt does a beautiful job of capturing that. Because that center of that painting is not the reconciliation. If you look at the geographic center, it's a gap. There's a gap between the reconciliation of the younger son and the older son and the elder son. And that gap is darkness. And while the elder son is somewhat in the light, he's not in the same light that bathes the father and the prodigal son. Question is he going to be able to cross that gap, that gulf, that darkness, and step into the light? Or is he going to be insistent on staying where he is and expecting the Father to come to him? And that's exactly what happens in the gospel. So you can imagine if you're the father and you're full of joy at the return of your son and your elder son is unwilling to come in, how insulting that might be, and you go out to plead with him and he doesn't come in because he feels that he's been wronged somehow. And so this is where resentment doesn't lead. So this is where we learn from the negative, right? Resentment doesn't lead to gratitude. He's not grateful to his father for all the things he has. He's just resentful. And he's certainly not filled with joy when the father's filled with joy at his younger son's return. I think it's really hard for us to somehow think that older brother is wrong. I mean, if we look deep in our hearts, do we think really that he should have came in? Do you think he should have joined in? Or do you think he had a good point? And he was doing what he should have done and stood his ground and showed that father that this was not acceptable. So examine your heart really deeply when we begin to compare how we might look at others and how we might look at ourselves in relationship to God. think taking a hard look at ourselves can be very humbling. And going back to the tax collector and the Pharisee praying, how many times might we think, well, I'm a good Catholic. Maybe I'm the only good Catholic in my family. Maybe I'm a good Catholic because I attend Mass on Sundays and I even go on holy days of obligation. I mean, that's another 5 or 6 days. How many of us kind of in the back of our minds think about other members of our family who were raised just like us? Do we feel sorry for them? Do we feel compassion for them? Or do we sort of judge them as unworthy? Because, well, I have been going to church all these years, and you know, just like I know, because you were raised Catholic too, that it's a mortal sin to miss Mass on Sunday. It's a mortal sin to miss Mass on holy days of obligation. That you should know better than to receive communion when you're in grave sin, etc., etc., etc. And all the while harboring a resentment not only for that sibling or that friend, but even more deep than that, possibly God himself. You know, in our country today, if I mention certain people's names, Joe Biden, Catholic, right? How many of you just kind of went, whoa, he said that in a homily? How many people might hear the name Nancy Pelosi, Catholic, and right away, did your just blood pressure and your resentment just kind of go, whoa, right? Right? Be honest. So imagine that moment when that prodigal son might be one of those people whom you resent. Maybe even consider an enemy, a traitor, a hypocrite, or whatever. And see, what's so hard for us is to realize the extent of God's mercy and how much God loves each and every one of us. And what does he not love us for? Well, he doesn't love me because of what I do, doesn't love me because of what I have, doesn't love me for my titles, just loves me. And I think that's hard for us because so much of our culture is based on earning love, earning trust, earning respect, earning places of honor, recognition, etc. And so we, in a sense, have a paradigm that we've done good things and achieved a certain result that isn't deserved by people that aren't like me, that don't work as hard as me, that don't perform as well as me, that aren't as, quote-unquote, good as me. So it's a somber message today. Until now. Because yesterday I went to confession. I even have a witness. "62 years," I said, "I have not been as joyful as I should have." 62 years. I've just finished this book called Living Joy by Chris Stefanik. I've mentioned it before in a homily or two. And this book has really been a life changer for me because it tells you to do three things. It tells you to recognize you're perfectly loved by God, that salvation has been won for you by Jesus on the cross, and that Jesus is always with you. Now, if I remember those three things, what's the natural reaction to that for me is to be grateful. And when you're grateful, you can't be resentful. You're just grateful. And so whenever you begin, maybe, to think about a thought that doesn't bring you joy, maybe it brings you resentment, maybe it brings you hate, maybe it brings you looking down upon another, judgment, etc., just try to remember those three things. Because if we can live with joy, We learn from the negative of the Pharisee, of the older brother, that God intends us to rejoice at that lost sheep, rejoice at that lost coin, to rejoice at that return of the lost son. Not to be resentful because we play that comparison game, but instead to rejoice in God's love for us. May God bless us all.
Please stand and let us profess our faith. I believe in one God,